starting with you, Ajamu, what's the current state of Niger, and what's for folks who aren't familiar with what's going on, why is that region so important, and why should France be pushed the fuck out? Pardon my language, folks.
I mean, what we have in Nigeria, what we have in Niger, what we have across the Sahel is the arrested process of decolonization now taking place. It's taking place today because of the shift in the objective forces that the Africans who are part of the French Empire, and it is an empire that was maintained on the African continent, now find themselves in a situation where they're able to maneuver in a different way. The masses are beginning to are making the argument for and rising up against the French in an argument for liberation, a process that many of the Anglophone and other states went through a few decades ago. Now, we understand that what was won was, in fact, flag independence. The colonial relationships continued under the form of neo-colonialism, the propping up of a new sector of compradors and national bourgeois elements, largely pursuing their common class interests with the European bourgeoisie, oftentimes though contradictory class interests, because the interests of the international bourgeoisie often clash with that of the compradors from time, the national bourgeoisie from time to time. That was resolved when you had the evolution and elevation of the comprador bourgeoisie, these bourgeoisie that have an interest in perpetuating the global relations of dominance, even in their own countries. So that was the class that served French interests for decades. That situation now is under duress. These forces are being displaced. What appears to be the agent of change at this moment appears to be the military, for various reasons, very complex reasons, in terms of what has happened in those countries in terms of the repression of democratic forces, of revolutionary forces in those countries, so that the seeds of opposition germinated in these militaries. And so we're seeing that as a consequence, again, these objective conditions ripening. We're seeing these military forces taking power, and they are now demanding the French to leave. They have demanded that to a certain extent with the U.S., even though there's some things there we could talk about. But it's clear that they are basically going to demand that the French leave. The French in Niger have said, "Hey, we're not going anyplace." It represented the arrogance of white supremacy, and arrogance we saw and we see in places like Iraq, where the Iraqis have told the U.S. to leave. They said, "We're not going." The Syrians have told them to leave. They said, "We're going to stay here, continue to steal the oil and occupy the territory." So, it's quite clear that these forces, this collective West, they're committed to use force. They're committed to do what they need to do in order to maintain their hegemony. And and African people and colonized people have to understand that, as Brother Jeruba said earlier, political power comes from the barrel of a gun, and that basically material force has to be met with material force, and that's what we're seeing in this part of Africa. But we got to be careful though, because there's some class forces there involved that it may not be as revolutionary as we would like them to be. We don't romanticize these situations because, again, we've got to stay clear-eyed and sober. We can't make errors based on our own subjective desires, okay? So we watch this process very, very closely. But as long as there's a shift, even gradual shift of power away from this pan-European colonial capitalist project, that's a good thing. And I think that's what we're seeing broadly there in West and Central Africa.
Okay. Deruba, give us your take.
I think Ajamu hit it right on the head. We can't be delusional and fantastical and think that everything that pops up as anti-French is necessarily anti-imperialist or anti-Western hegemony. I think Gabon is going to probably be the closest, the clearest example of that, as that plays itself out. But I think that one of the things that Ajamu pointed out is that there has to be, or there should be, a critical mass that is susceptible to revolutionary organization, that is receptive of 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 strategies and tactics and an analysis that can complete the task of removing these neo-colonialists from Africa. There are serious class differences in Africa amongst the political ruling elite and the masses of the people that they rule over. And this is in every country. And we also need to understand of the 54 countries in Africa, all of them have been delineated and their boundaries established by the colonial powers. And they cut across linguistic, ethnic lines and religious affiliations. I think a reread of Kwame Nkrumah's Conscientism is on the table right now, where Kwame Nkrumah talks about how do we resolve this mass of differences between different peoples in Africa in many regions that have different histories. But one thing that I want to point out, having lived in West Africa since 1993, is that many of the political elites that we see in power today come from the clans and tribes that collaborated with the slavers in exporting us to to uh, to the so-called New World. So not much has changed in that respect in terms of the differences between certain African ethnic groups and their histories. We have to understand that every group, well, let me put it this way. In order to achieve the type of clarity and the somber understanding of what's going on, I like to use a quote from Alombe Brath, who in many ways mentored my understanding of Pan Africanism on a whole new level. The late Alombe Brath from Harlem said that Africans in Africa suffer from a deep emotional and psychological syndrome that he called the residual absentee colonial mentality, and that we, on the other hand, suffer from a similar syndrome, but it's the absentee slave mentality. And this is something that if we sit down and analyze what's meant by this, it means that, as Ajamu was talking about, there is a sea change in Africa that's happening amongst the young people in Africa who have begun to recognize that their former colonial masters are part and parcel of the reason why they are in the state of poverty, of hunger, of disorganization and miasma that they are presently in. And that it's their ruling elite, the older generation, who found comfort and wealth from this collaboration with the former colonizers, who seem to be holding them down and holding them back. Okay, now this is a unique a phenomena because it's occurring as the U.S. global hegemony is beginning to deteriorate. And so we see how the West tries to play off anti so-called anti-democratic attitudes and place the opposition party. They'll support one opposition party against the leadership, whether that leadership is progressive or not. just to create the contradictions that will allow them to penetrate that particular society and that particular culture to their own benefits. We know that ISIS was created by the United States, and then the United States turns around and declares a war on terror, a global war on terror against the same organizations and entities that they created. We know that the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi was a project of NATO, France, and the United States. And that led to some of the contradictions that we now have in the Sahel between certain so-called Islamic movements and so-called Islamic terrorists. You see, many of the movements that are classified in Africa as reactionary or Islamist have their roots in the class contradictions and the neo-colonial relationships between the people that comprise that group and those who are in power. If we take Cameroon, for instance, Cameroon is divided along linguistics as well as tribal contradictions. There's an English-speaking Cameroon and there's a French-speaking Cameroon. Who does the French support over the other? Of course, they support the French-speaking Cameroon over the English. Well, does the Anglophones, the British and them support the English? Not really. So we need to understand, as Ajamu pointed out, these things are not as simple as they first appear. They're not as easily sorted out as they first appear. I mean, if we look at Chad and we look at the regime that's in power there, we see the role that Chad played in the war with Libya, in the Central African Republic, who was the ruling family there for years. If we look at the Sudan, and what's happening in the Sudan. We remember when they talked about the Janjaweed and the murder of Sudanese. What was that all about? It was Arab-speaking Janjaweed, you understand, killing non-Arab speaking Africans. But they're all black. So if we're locked just on race and color, you see, we are out of the mix. We don't understand what's taking place. How is it that Kenya sends police and mercenaries to Haiti? Kenya. And now we know what happened with Haiti and France and how they've been impoverished and indemnified by France for over 2 centuries. Okay, but who colonized Kenya? It was the British. You see what I'm saying? So we have to understand the global dynamics of this and how it impacts on us here. And this is why we have to deal with the situation here. When we talk about Cop City, we're talking about them institutionalizing programs that they've been carrying out since the beginning of the Cold War. Israeli police have been training with American police officers since long before the Black Panther Party was even formed in 1966. There's an NYPD office in Tel Aviv, and the NYPD doesn't have any international credentials. It's a domestic law enforcement agency. This is why calling them police is a misnomer. They're armed agents of the state. And the state's racist white supremacy, a subjugation of African people here in the United States, is reflected in its foreign policy. And it's reflected in the dynamics of its foreign policy. So what do? We have black faces in high places. We have a congressional black caucus that we have not challenged, that cannot hold a community talk or a community program to explain to black people what is happening in Africa and what position they're going to take in the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee. The whole face of U.S. foreign policy today and U.S. militarism is black. We have a black a woman who represents the U.S. in the United Nations. We have a black Secretary of State. We have a black Vice President. I mean, how, and so when the world looks at this is a reflection of us. You see, I have a passport of the empire. I have an American passport. What does that mean when I go back to West Africa and America is subordinating, is supporting and undermining the legitimacy of African people? How am I viewed then? What is my role going to be? You see, and we see that when we have something like the year of return recently, we see how citizenship, dual citizenship, is given to the Rick Rosses and rappers and prominent black figures. We have Kenya talking about they're giving out dual citizenship. You can get a Kenyan passport in less than 2 weeks now. Why? Because they intend to pimp and use us and use the class contradictions that have evolved within us amongst ourselves to their own advantages. But most of the people that wind up in Africa, investing in Africa, come from a certain class and in our society. Not everybody can get a passport and fly off to Africa and say, here I am, I'm ready to make a move, I'm ready to do something. There's only a certain class of African people here that are able to do that. Now, what is their political consciousness then? What do they represent when they go to Africa? We have to think about these things. And therefore, I think Ajamu was right on point when he said that we can't just take it for granted that simply because the military now has become more of a historical, in this historical moment, more revolutionary than they used to be. Most of the coups in Africa were carried out at the behest of the European imperialists. You know, they were the ones that backed the coups. Now we have officers, young officers, who were trained by Americans who are talking about empowering their people. This is shock the imperialist nations. This is shock the French. That's why the French are acting so stupid, you know, and refusing to make certain moves. They're shocked by the fact, man, we trained these guys. Now they're flipping on us. You see? So we need to understand that what's happening globally affects and impacts everything, especially when we talk about things like Cop City and we talk about migrant labor and migrants being used to undermine the black vote in the United States. We got a black cop, a bootlicking Negro, who's the mayor of New York. How did he become the mayor of New York? You think that the black Democrats in New York had nothing to do with this?